You know, I once read that a really good gauge for how good a fantasy book is how good scenes from it would look airbrushed on the side of a van back in the 80s. Think about it. You're driving around town, and on one side of your van you've got the Eye of Sauron, and on the other you've got Conan the Barbarian. And you know, it says a lot about what those works are like. The novel we're reviewing today somehow manages to hand both of those images their butts. Because in terms of what you put on the hood of a 78 Thunderbird, you really can't beat punching a demon to death while wearing power armor. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Book Cafe, where we review fiction, talk fantasy, and interview authors. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and if you're a veteran, welcome back. Today we'll be reading a book that was recommended to us by Peter Brett after our interview with him. There'll be a link to that interview at the end of the video if you want to check it out. We were reviewing The Armored Saint by Mike Cole. Now with a title like that, you'd expect this work to kick a lot of butt. You'll be delighted to learn that it does. This is Cole's first foray into the medieval fantasy genre. If you look at a lot of his backlist, most of his writing thus far has involved Navy SEAL warlocks, which is one of the coolest concepts I've ever encountered. But he managed to convey a pretty big and pretty vibrant world in not a lot of space. There's two things that I really want to point out about this book. The first is its unusual genre. There are a lot of subgenres in fantasy, and generally when you start in a small village, that's a pretty good sign that you're in heroic or high fantasy. And you know, that's mostly going to be things like Wheel of Time, Sword of Truth, technically Star Wars if you get right down to it. And when it comes to low fantasy and grimdark, a lot of that is cities. How much of Game of Thrones is based around politics? Same with the First Law trilogy, or Nevernight. They don't really exist without the city, without the political atmosphere. So what Cole has done is something very interesting. I think The Armored Saint is the first time I can point to an instance of pastoral grimdark. The whole story takes place within these two small villages. By the end of it, both of them are pretty much destroyed, and that's the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. As a result, you get this really interesting juxtaposition that brings across how powerless these people really are. So if you've read or watched Game of Thrones and your favorite characters are the Brotherhood without banners, it's sort of like that. It's when the world is terrible, the people who feel it the worst are going to be the ones at the bottom, not the ones at the top. I mean, not a lot of dark fantasy talks about the ones at the bottom, usually because there's not much interesting going on with them. And in keeping of that theme of powerlessness is the second thing I want to talk about. The main character, Heloise, spelled with an H, so I think it's Heloise, I'm not quite sure, is a young girl just about to hit puberty. A lot of my favorite fantasy books have main characters who are pretty young. It's a staple of the genre. But past a certain point, you know, it's hard to keep writing them as children. Harry Potter does seem to act like an adult more often than not. And so, when Heloise is so demonstrably a child in the face of all of the terrible things that are happening, and that's the thing that Cole does special, is that Heloise is written in such a way that she feels like a child, and she's written like someone who is just coming into her own agency and doesn't know what to do with it. And it's an incredibly nuanced character. And this is what gets into the third thing. Mike Cole is not afraid to hurt his characters. And you might think that's not special. After all, you've probably seen Game of Thrones. But there's a difference between not being afraid to kill them and not being afraid to hurt them. I'm trying to spoil as little as I can. By the end of the novel, Heloise has suffered so brutally that you actually get this real sense of trauma from her and from the people around her. You can see the tension. It's kind of a deconstruction of the teenage hero / chosen one. She's kind of what a Joan of Arc figure would look like if you put an untrained Joan of Arc on the front lines. So no bones about it, this book is dark and brutal. There's a point near the middle where I nearly lost my lunch. And if you don't like violence, do not read it. If you're okay with violence and despair and those kinds of things, then I would put this book at buy it new. Cole does some of the most incredible things with characters that I've seen. and makes you feel as destroyed in the aftermath as anyone would have any right to be. If a demon used your friend's eyeball as a portal from hell and tore his body apart from the inside and then ransacked your town. It's one of the rare books I've seen where the villains are technically right and yet still completely hateable. This is not a book for the faint of heart. Now, big news, we're actually going to be interviewing Mike Cole sometime in May. So be on the lookout for that. We should also have an interview up next week with John Joseph Adams, the editor of the John Joseph Adams imprint, as well as Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines. If you like this video, remember to click on the like button, or click on the dragon to watch more videos like this from the Book Cafe. And click here to watch part 1 of the Peter V. Brett interview. And I will see everyone next week. Until then, read good fantasy.